The summer of 2025 turned a familiar US-India trade tussle into a near systemic rupture. On July 30th, President Donald Trump announced a 25% reciprocal tariff on Indian imports, framed as a response to unfair trade practices, and formalized it the next day under emergency authorities. After a short runway for shipments already on the water, the tariff took force on August 7th. 3 weeks later, the tariff on India was raised to 50% due to its crude purchase from Russia. Namaskar and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Rajiv Kumar Singh. In this episode of History Behind Headlines, we will try and analyze America's tariff and India's resilience. The renowned American diplomat Henry Kissinger once remarked, "It may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal." For India, this is hardly a new lesson, one it has encountered repeatedly in its nearly 80 years as an independent nation. Yet, those words have acquired renewed relevance in recent days, weeks and months. Despite being projected as a strategic partner, India now finds itself confronting Washington's increasingly aggressive tariff regime. How New Delhi navigates America's diplomatic pressure, commercial coercion, and economic overreach may well shape its foreseeable future as a rising power determined to secure its rightful place in the Committee of Nations. From steel and aluminum duties to restrictions on critical exports such as pharmaceuticals and IT services, India perceives a deliberate pattern of economic coercion. Even so, New Delhi's response has been measured and strategic, signaling that it is no longer prepared to play the role of a compliant junior partner. 30th July was the day America announced reciprocal tariff on India. Trump's tariff escalation came on the 6th of August. The White House added a secondary 25% penalty explicitly tied to India's intake of discounted Russian crude.
We put a 50% tariff on India on oil. They're the second largest. They're very close to China in terms of the purchase of oil from Russia.
If you do reach a deal with Ukraine and Russia, would you drop the additional tariffs on India?
Well, we'll determine that later, but right now they're paying a 50% tariff.
This add-on kicked in on August 27th, turning the overall duty for many lines into a prohibitive 50%. The message was as political as it was economic. New Delhi's energy choices would carry a price in the US market. For India, the timing landed amid solid macro signals and active trade diplomacy with Europe and the UK, intensifying the sense that Washington was against India's strategic autonomy rather than merely arbitrating tariffs.
कोई हमारे साथ अच्छा फ्री ट्रेड एग्रीमेंट करना चाहे तो उसके लिए तो हम सदैव तैयार हैं, पर किसी भी प्रकार का भेदभाव मुझे लगता है भारत का 140 करोड़ देशवासियों का जो आत्मविश्वास है, आत्मसम्मान है, उसको मद्देनजर रखते हुए हम ना तो कभी झुकेंगे ना कभी कमजोर होंगे। एक साथ मिलकर हम आगे बढ़ते रहेंगे, नई मार्केट्स कैप्चर करेंगे। मैं आपको दावे से कह सकता हूं इस साल हमारी एक्सपोर्ट पिछले साल से ज्यादा होगी।
Tariffs are taxes on imports. Historically, they brought in revenue and sheltered domestic industries, today they are frequently leveraged tools in bargaining. The US menu includes standard MFN tariffs, reciprocal retaliation, Section 301 punitive duties, and, blurring the boundary with sanctions, secondary tariffs, which punish a country not for bilateral conduct per se, but for conduct with a third party. Sanctions span trade bans, asset freezes, financing blocks, and travel bans. Secondary sanctions extend the penalty to anyone dealing with a sanctioned actor, weaponizing access to dollar funding and global banking rails. Having honed this model with Iran, Cuba, and Russia since 2014, and especially after 2022, Washington now applies a similar logic to India's oil calculus. Even though the United States once welcomed India's Russian purchases to stabilize global prices.
We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian oil, that is China. We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian LNG. I'm not sure, but I think that is the European Union. We are not the country which has the biggest trade surge with Russia after 2022. I think there are some countries to the south. We are a country where actually the Americans said for the last few years that we should do everything to stabilize the world energy markets, including buying oil from Russia. Incidentally, we also buy oil from America, and that amount has been increasing. So, quite honestly, we are very perplexed at the logic of the argument that you had.
The controversy is not just legalistic. To targeted states, such measures amount to economic coercion and an encroachment on sovereign policy making. US trade policy has long mixed tariffs, export controls, and investment screens into a single statecraft toolkit. In the Cold War, regimes like COCOM or Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls and later the NSG, that is Nuclear Suppliers Group, restricted technology flows, hurting non-aligned countries seeking dual-use tech for civilian and strategic programs. India's path in this case is illustrative. The 1974 nuclear test triggered sweeping tech blocks. The 1998 tests led to sanctions that throttled defense and dual-use imports. Even during rapprochement, Washington used GSP, Generalized System of Preferences carrots and withdrawals to push market opening. Often, tariffs were paired with export licensing hurdles, R&D exclusions, and third country pressure, ensuring critical technologies stayed behind a gate. The lesson New Delhi draws in 2025 is old but sharp. US tariff moves are rarely only about trade balances. They are instruments used against rising powers whose policy diverged from Washington's strategic preferences. Talking about mechanics, 25% reciprocal tariff is effective from August 7th. This is a broad coverage preached as responding to India's barriers. Additional 25% secondary tariffs is effective from August 27th, triggered by Russian oil linkages. Together, they lift exposure to 50% on many lines. Exemptions are limited in-transit carve-outs with room for future carve-outs tied to national security screens. Meaning, if Indian goods are routed through US ports, say via supply chains to Latin America or Canada, some of those shipments might be spared tariffs, but only narrowly and on a case-to-case basis. US-India two-way goods trade totaled $129 billion in 2024, with a $45.8 billion US trade deficit, according to US Census Bureau data. Exporter groups estimate that tariffs would affect nearly 55% of India's over $87 billion merchandise exports to the US, while benefiting competitors such as Vietnam, Bangladesh, China, and even Pakistan. Highly price-sensitive goods like gems and garments suffer first. Complex supply chain goods like auto components and electronics feel it as contracts roll over. Talking about stated motives, the Trump administration cites reciprocity and claims of profiteering on Russian crude, arguing India's intake indirectly adds to Moscow's war chest. Officials cite a rapid rise in India's share of Russian oil since 2022. As far as strategic motive goes, it is to pressure Russia without throttling China or antagonizing Europe. By squeezing the next best lever, India's access to US market. Layered onto the tariff fight is a renewed US tilt toward Pakistan. New trade concessions, energy partnerships and friendlier rhetoric. Islamabad seized the moment, publicly crediting President Trump for diffusing South Asian tensions and theatrically embracing his statesmanship, while India reiterated its categorical rejection of third-party mediation on India-Pakistan tensions, including Kashmir. For New Delhi, the juxtaposition is galling. Punitive duties for an essential energy strategy and diplomatic warmth extended to a rival capital. Adding to the complexity is Washington's continued engagement with Pakistan and its periodic commentary on Kashmir. Pakistan's Army Chief Asim Munir's lunch at the White House and his 2 visits to the US within 2 months have been closely watched in India. His provocative statements made on US soil have not gone unnoticed in New Delhi. While often couched in calls for dialogue and stability, much of what Pakistan articulates today strikes a raw nerve in India, where Kashmir is regarded as an integral part of its sovereign territory and a settled constitutional matter following the abrogation of Article 370 in 2019. India's position is clear. Kashmir is a bilateral issue with Pakistan, and external references, particularly from strategic partners, are viewed as unnecessary intrusions. The implications go beyond bilateral sensitivities. The Quad, that consists of US, India, Japan and Australia, rests on mutual trust and shared understanding of each member's strategic priorities. The latest as far as Quad goes is that Donald Trump has cancelled his trip to India for the Leaders Summit scheduled in November. Meanwhile, a federal appeals court in the US has ruled that most of Donald Trump's tariffs are an overreach of his use of emergency powers as president. The so-called reciprocal tariffs imposed on nearly every country the US trades with are being illegally imposed, said the US Court of Appeals. The court did not halt the tariffs but instead said they would remain in place until mid-October, setting up a further legal challenge in the US Supreme Court.
We are leading very substantially with AI. We're leading because of tariffs. We're leading because of talent, and this is where they'd like to be. But without the tariffs, we wouldn't have a chance because we wouldn't be able to protect those investments of the companies coming in. So if you took away tariffs, we could end up being a third world country.
India imports 80 to 85% of its crude needs. In 2022 to 2025, discounted Russian oil functioned as a macro shock absorber, moderating inflation, preserving fiscal space for capex and welfare, and keeping growth intact. New Delhi's position is unambiguous. Energy security is sovereign. Analysts also highlight the Trump administration's persistent demand for India to open up its agriculture, dairy and other sectors, moves that could impact the livelihoods of millions. While these sectors undoubtedly require large-scale reforms to become competitive both domestically and globally, the Trump administration must recognize that the policies of a nation of 1.4 billion cannot be dictated by the preferences of foreign capitals.
साथियों, हमारे लिए अपने किसानों का हित सर्वोच्च प्राथमिकता है। भारत अपने किसानों के, पशुपालकों के और मछुआरे भाई बहनों के हितों के साथ कभी भी समझौता नहीं करेगा। और मैं जानता हूं व्यक्तिगत रूप से मुझे बहुत बड़ी कीमत चुकानी पड़ेगी, लेकिन मैं इसके लिए तैयार हूं।
India's stance dovetails with Atmanirbharta, the push to become a resilient manufacturing-led economy. The tariffs, ironically, accelerate that pivot. Export diversification to EU, UK, ASEAN, Africa, Latin America is the need of the hour to reduce single market dependence. Production-linked incentive, PLI schemes in electronics, pharma, renewables, autos and textiles can deepen domestic value chains. Supply-side reforms such as GST rationalization, logistics upgrades and MSME credit support will raise productivity and shock absorption capacity. India is not pretending that there is no pain. It is arguing that the pain is manageable and the long-term payoff, greater economic autonomy, is worth the short-term strain. Despite tariff headlines, India's macro picture looks sturdier than many expected. Rating agencies have affirmed India's investment-grade standing with a stable outlook, and growth forecasts for FY26 is around 6.5%. Business chambers estimate the direct tariff hit at 0.19 to 1% of GDP, noting that affected lines account for less than 2% of India's global exports. In plain terms, the shock is specific and sharp for some sectors but modest in the aggregate, especially if the government leans into diversification, export promotion and domestic substitution where viable. Where it bites first is gems and jewelry. The Surat polishing hub is ground zero. Order cancellations and price point compression can push thousands of workers out, revealing how quickly consumer-facing luxuries buckle when margins vanish. Ready-made garments and leather. Thin margins plus long lead times equal rapid squeeze in these sectors. Some exporters can explore costly workarounds, for example, third country finishes. That, however, would inevitably erode their competitiveness. Electronics and auto components. Exposure rises as contracts renew. Firms will try to reroute, respec or relocate or co-locate final assembly closer to buyers. Moves that take time and capital. The real question is duration. A 6-month shock is one thing. A multi-year wall is another. New Delhi's hedging, more markets, new corridors and domestic capacity aims to keep the shock short. What goes up on the border shows up on the shelf. A 50% headline tariff on price-sensitive imports implies higher US retail prices for fashion, jewelry, select electronics and auto spares. Beyond consumer pain, companies that rely on Indian inputs, textiles, fisheries, IT-enabled services, specialized components confront resourcing costs and time lags. The unevenness is the point, not a bug. China increased its share of discounted Russian crude but dodges parallel sanctions because US industry remains deeply fused with Chinese supply chains, from electronics and batteries to rare earths and green tech. A direct hit would risk global dislocation. Europe, still absorbing the energy shock of the Ukraine war and juggling domestic politics, is spared to preserve transatlantic unity. Washington calculates that disciplining India shows resolve without detonating Western cohesion or global supply lines. Talking about India's strategic options, India needs to keep the Quad separate from tariffs. New Delhi can maintain maritime and tech cooperation with the US, Japan and Australia on semiconductors, undersea cables, critical minerals, even while contesting the tariff war. Partitioning files avoids letting a trade dispute derail security priorities. Multiply markets. Push FTAs with the EU over the line. Fast-track lanes into ASEAN, Africa and Latin America. Leverage corridors like India, Middle East, Europe to shorten supply lines and reduce risk premium. Speed up domestic substitution where rational. PLI and targeted procurement can lift electronics sub-assemblies, EV components, medical devices and green tech. The goal is to make Indian industries globally competitive, not to create a closed, self-sufficient economy like pre-1991. Protectionism for its own sake would harm innovation and growth. Cushion at home surgically. Some financial measures need to be precisely targeted and carefully executed to achieve maximum effect with minimal collateral damage. Temporary credit lines, export rebates and reskilling for hit clusters. Surat, Tirupur, Kanpur blunt social pain while firms reroute orders. Blanket subsidies that ossify inefficiency needs to be avoided. Use legal and diplomatic channels. File WTO consultations to preserve procedural rights. Seek product-level exclusions where US buyer dependence is high, like certain generics, APIs, specialty inputs. Keep lines open to the US Treasury and USTR for sequencing and carve-outs. Energy realism. India can look to continue portfolio diversification, Middle Eastern crude, US LNG, green hydrogen pilots, while keeping Russian barrels in the mix so long as pricing, logistics and policy space allow. While immediate de-escalation seems difficult, US inflation and lobby pressure can work for India in middle to long term. If tariff pass-through stretches household budgets or snarls healthcare procurement, domestic pressure mounts for exemptions and adjustments. Face-saving deals cannot be ruled out. Washington can claim progress on market access or monitoring while quietly modulating rates. New Delhi can resequence some energy purchases without conceding sovereignty. Allied calculus can also work. If the tariff wall undercuts the Quad or Indo-Pacific tech goals, allied capitals can nudge for a step down. Russia is also a variable in all this. Any change in the Ukraine vector or energy pricing reduces the salience of India's discounted crude. Here, it is interesting to note that in July 2025, India became Ukraine's largest diesel supplier, providing 15.5% of its total imports, with daily shipments averaging 2,700 tons. In a nutshell, India's maneuvers with the US require craft, framing, timing and selective concessions that leave each side able to say it stood firm. Indian Trade Ministry officials note that the average tariff on US imports is around 7.5%. In contrast, the US trade representatives stress that India imposes tariffs as high as 100% on automobiles and an average applied tariff rate of 39% on American farm goods. It is fair to say that India does not yet possess the same leverage as China to force an immediate policy rethink from the Trump administration. However, the US would do well not to overlook the vast Indian talent pool that significantly contributes to the American economy. Moreover, India is projected to become the world's third largest economy within the next 2 to 3 years and remains the fastest growing major economy. If trade ties between India and the US slow down, the impact will not be one-sided. America too will face long-term consequences, even if India is currently bearing the immediate burden. That said, India has some sectors where vulnerabilities are evident, with farming, dairy and fisheries being the most prominent. Washington, and particularly President Trump, needs to recognize this reality. Statements such as India agreeing to zero tariffs on US products, claims that India is the sole beneficiary of bilateral trade, and some of the extreme remarks made by his trade advisor Peter Navarro are unlikely to help move negotiations forward. Still, given the scope of India-US trade relationship, it may not be all gloom and doom for the world's fourth largest economy. Tariffs can force conversations, but rarely forge trust. The 2025 measures treat India less as a strategic equal and more as a lever in a separate fight with Moscow, while letting China and Europe sidestep equivalent pain. That selectivity weakens the moral and strategic logic of the policy and risks blowing back onto US consumers, hospitals and manufacturers. India, for its part, is signaling that energy sovereignty and Atmanirbharta are non-negotiable, even as it works to keep the Quad intact, diversify markets and shore up exposed sectors at home. The likely landing zone is not capitulation, but managed de-escalation, narrower converge, targeted exclusions and a quiet return to negotiation. A durable US-India partnership cannot be tariff managed. It has to be co-built on semiconductors and clean energy, supply chains and maritime security, and a shared understanding that coercion is a poor substitute for strategy. If Washington wants an India that values West in a turbulent century, the path is partnership, not pressure. And if New Delhi wants lasting policy space, the path is resilience, the kind that turns shocks into catalysts and frictions into focus. That is all we have in this program. Thanks for watching.
संसद टीवी के और भी प्रोग्राम्स देखने के लिए सब्सक्राइब करें हमारा YouTube चैनल और हाँ, इन्हें लाइक और शेयर करना ना भूलें।